Welcome to Eerie Echoes. Tonight, we bring you 7 true horror stories from the heart of Appalachia. These aren't legends told around the campfire. These are real accounts of vanishings, strange deaths, and encounters that leave behind more questions than answers. From children who disappeared in front of their families, to hikers who left behind neat camps they never returned to tunnels where lanterns still swing in the dark. Each story will take you deeper into the silence of the mountains. So settle in, keep the lights low, and let's begin. Most hikers leave footprints. Some leave nothing at all. In the Appalachians, there are trails where people vanish so completely it feels less like accident, and more like the mountains chose to keep them. I've lived my life in the shadow of the Appalachians. These mountains are old, older than America itself, worn down but never tamed. People think they re-safe because they re-not jagged like the Rockies or remote like Alaska. But the truth is, these ridges hide something deeper. I used to believe every disappearance had an explanation. Bad weather, poor judgment, maybe even foul play. Then I began hearing the stories that repeated like echoes, stories that shared details too strange to ignore. The first story I ever heard was about a boy, no older than 8, hiking with his family near Mac's Patch, along the Tennessee-North Carolina border. He stepped off the trail to pick blueberries, just a few feet within sight. His uncle turned his head for only a moment. When he looked back, the boy was gone. They searched the brush immediately, shouting his name. He couldn't have run far. But the forest was silent. By nightfall, rain hammered the ground so hard it washed away tracks. Hundreds of volunteers came. Dogs sniffed but refused to follow any scent. Days later, a single sock was found snagged on a bush, strangely dry despite the storm. That was all. The pattern repeated with an old man, Mitty Rivers, in 1945. He was 74 but strong, an experienced guide leading hunters in the Vermont wilderness near Glastonbury Mountain. He walked just a little ahead of the group, rounded a bend, and never came back. They thought he'd tripped, maybe wandered off the trail. But after weeks of searching, nothing was ever found. Not his rifle, not a scrap of clothing. He had disappeared as if the woods had swallowed him whole. And then, there are the hunters. One story I can't shake is about a man from Bryson City, North Carolina, who vanished in the Nantahala National Forest. He knew the land like the back of his hand. One autumn afternoon, he and his brother split up briefly in a boulder field. The brother saw him wave from the ridge. Minutes later, when he climbed to meet him, the spot was empty. Searchers later found his rifle leaned neatly against a stump. No tracks, no body, no sign of struggle. Just a weapon waiting for an owner who never returned. The cases go on. Children vanish while parents watch. Adults vanish in broad daylight, their belongings later discovered folded, tidy, almost deliberate. Dogs brought to search refuse to track. They circle, whine, then lie down as if confused. Sudden storms roll in, drenching the mountains, erasing signs. People are found in impossible locations, miles away over ridges too steep for them to have crossed, or in areas already searched many times. Some are found alive, but with no memory of where they were during the missing time. I remember one case in particular. A woman in her 30s hiking near the Shining Rock Wilderness. She texted her sister a photo of a quartz outcrop, promising to be home that evening. She never returned. 2 days later, searchers found her body less than 2 miles from the trail, sitting upright against a tree. Her boots were off, socks folded neatly on top. Her pack was zipped, belongings untouched. She had no injuries that explained her death. The coroner listed exposure, but no one could explain why she had removed her shoes in the cold, or why she had been missed in areas already searched. I've walked those same woods. Once, on a foggy evening, I was part of a search line. We flagged trees with pink tape as we moved. I followed the sound of water, but the creek kept changing direction around me. At one point, I swear I heard a woman's voice say, "Here," clear and close. I answered. My own voice fell flat, as if the air itself swallowed it. 10 minutes later, I found myself back at a tree I had already flagged. I'd walked in a circle without realizing it. That night, we found nothing. Skeptics say there's nothing mysterious here. They argue that the Appalachians are full of hazards: sudden storms, thick laurel, hidden sinkholes, caves, predators. They say the missing lost their bearings or made fatal mistakes. But those who know the stories see the patterns, the same conditions repeating across decades and states. Bright clothing that should have made someone easy to spot. Dogs refusing the trail. Bodies appearing where searchers had already looked. Items folded, left behind as if deliberately placed. I don't know what the truth is. Maybe it's only the cruelty of nature. Maybe there are people out there, living feral, waiting for opportunities. Or maybe the forest itself has rules we can't understand. Rules that sometimes demand a life. I can tell you this. When you're alone in those woods and the silence grows thick, you start to feel like you're being counted. And not everyone counted makes it back. Missing 411 isn't about monsters hiding in the dark. It's about the silence that repeats, the patterns that stretch across years and miles. In the Appalachians, people vanished not because of what they carried or forgot, but because sometimes the mountains themselves decide not to give them back. If stories like this unsettle you, help us keep telling them. Subscribe, share, and keep the fire burning, because these names deserve to be remembered. And the strangest of all? Sometimes the vanishings happen in front of witnesses. In 1969, in the Smoky Mountains, a 6-year-old boy in a red shirt disappeared before his father's eyes. His name was Dennis Martin, and that's the next story. A child's laughter is supposed to be one of the purest sounds in the world, but in the Smoky Mountains, back in 1969, that laughter cut off so suddenly, it left behind only a silence that still haunts these ridges. I've spent enough nights in the Appalachians to know how quickly joy can turn into dread. You think you're safe among family, sitting on the grass while children play, and then, in the span of a heartbeat, someone you love is simply gone. That's what happened to the Martin family, and if you stand long enough in Spence Field, you can almost feel the weight of it pressing down on you. It was Father's Day weekend, June of 1969. William Martin brought his family up to the Smokies for a picnic. The air was thick with summer heat, but up in the ridges there was a breeze, the kind that carries the smell of wet earth and pine. Families spread out blankets and kids tore off into the grass, darting between the tree line and the open field. Dennis Martin was 6 years old. He was small for his age, but quick, dressed in a bright red shirt that should have made him impossible to lose among the green. The kids started a game of hide and seek, plotting to sneak up and surprise the adults. I've walked that trail. I've seen those tangles of laurel and rhododendron, perfect hiding places for a boy his size. Dennis darted off with a grin, slipping into the brush, just a few feet away from where his father watched. That was the last time anyone saw him. At first, it was just confusion. His brothers jumped out laughing, but Dennis didn't. His father called his name. No answer. He walked to where Dennis had entered the bushes, expecting him to leap out. The branches shook slightly, as if something had passed through, but there was no boy. Just shadows and leaves. Minutes stretched into hours. The Martins searched frantically, voices echoing through the field. Other campers joined in. The sun slid lower, and the ridges grew dark. By the time the first drops of rain began to fall, Dennis had been missing for nearly 3 hours. His father kept saying, He was right there in front of me. The storm that rolled in that night was one of the worst that summer. Sheets of rain pounded the ground, washing away any trace of footprints. Temperatures dropped into the 40s. For a child lost in the woods with no shelter, no fire, it was a death sentence. But searchers refused to give up. By the next day, more than 1,000 people were combing the mountains. Rangers, locals, even a group of Green Berets who came in with night vision equipment and radios. They swept the valleys, searched caves, dragged streams. Dogs picked up a scent but lost it at the edge of a creek, as though it had vanished into thin air. Every lead unraveled. I've read the official reports, but it's the unofficial accounts that still keep me awake. One man camping miles away claimed he saw something strange that evening. A bear-like figure, he said, moving swiftly through the trees, carrying something small and limp across its shoulders. Authorities dismissed it as a confused sighting, but locals whispered about it for decades. Some said it was a wild man living feral in the hills. Others thought it was something older, something that doesn't have a name. What unsettles me most is the absolute lack of evidence. Not a shoe, not a scrap of cloth from that red shirt. Searchers covered miles of terrain, yet it was as if the mountain had swallowed the boy whole. In these parts, we say the forest chooses who it keeps. And sometimes when you stand on Spence Field at dusk, it feels like the trees are watching, waiting for another name to take. Years later, I walked that ridge myself. The grass was high, the tree line just as thick. I remember the quiet pressing down, heavy enough to make my chest tighten. You don't hear birds there after a certain hour. You just hear your own breathing, and sometimes, faintly, what might be a laugh carried on the wind. I stopped and listened, and I swear, for a moment, I thought I heard a child's voice. Just a single syllable, no louder than a breath. I can't say what happened to Dennis Martin. Some believe he fell into a hidden sinkhole or cave, lost forever beneath the mountain. Some insist it was an animal attack, though predators leave signs, and there were none. Others cling to the wild man theory, the idea that someone out there took him, carried him deeper into the Smokies where no search could reach. But here's the truth. Nobody knows. And maybe that's why his story lingers, because it could happen to anyone. You can be laughing one second, chasing after fireflies, and the next, gone. Dennis Martin remains missing to this day. 50 years have passed, and his story is still told around Appalachian campfires. A child in a red shirt, last seen stepping into the trees never to return. The silence that followed has become part of the Smokies themselves. If stories like this unsettle you, remember, support helps us keep telling them. Subscribe, share, and stay with us as we uncover more truths the mountains would rather keep hidden. Because Dennis's case isn't the only one. Not far from here, years later, another hiker vanished. An experienced woman who left behind pages of a diary that told her last days. Her name was Geraldine Largay, and her story is the next we'll face together. On the Appalachian Trail, the forest doesn't always take the reckless. Sometimes it waits for someone who should have made it out, a careful walker with a plan, then closes the path behind her. I remember the summer the news first reached us, 2013, high season on the Appalachian Trail, when boots and laughter and trail names drift like pollen along the ridgeline. Her real name was Geraldine Largay, but other hikers called her Jerry and Inchworm. She wasn't new to the woods. She had trained for this stretch, folded her maps until they behaved, circled meeting points with her husband, and kept a neat list of miles to be earned each day, like a careful cashier counting change. On July 22nd, morning mist sat low over the Maine woods. Up there, the trees' close ranks, fir and spruce pressing their needles through the air until sound has to thread itself to get through. Jerry left Poplar Ridge lean-to the way most people leave a safe place, meaning to return to another one by dark. The plan was simple. Follow blazes, keep north, make Spaulding Mountain lean-to by afternoon, meet her husband the next day. That's all the plan ever is up there. White blazes and time. What I know of that day is a braid of facts and footprints, and the soft places in between. Hikers met her that morning. They say she was steady, polite, not rattled. No storm on the horizon. Just that honest, humid heat that turns every breath into work. Somewhere after Poplar Ridge, the trail shouldered into thicker growth, and the blazes turned shy where blowdowns forced the footpath to kink. There are places where, if you step 3 paces aside to relieve yourself, the trail erases itself behind you like a mouth closing. By evening, she hadn't reached Spaulding. Her husband waited at the road crossing where they'd agreed, watching the line of trees as if they were a curtain that might open. Darkness came. The curtain didn't move. He called. Rangers called. Within hours, the grid was drawn, and men and dogs and rotors lifted the canopy's green lid, hunting for a single figure wrapped in reasonable gear and experience. They found nothing. When news travels the way a chill travels, it leaves a residue in the towns. In Franklin County, the talk was baffled at first. It had that edge of disbelief that always follows a practical person gone missing. She had a compass, a phone that couldn't find the sky, but still a phone. Layers, rations, training. Hikers with less preparation lose the thread and roll it back with daylight. Jerry didn't. I went up there 2 weeks later. I tell myself I was helping look, but the truth is, the forest had lodged the story in me, and stories like that want a witness. The land there is mischief and order at once. Old logging cuts grown over into green corridors, boulders like frozen animals, gullies that funnel sound until the trickle of water behind you seems in front of you. I stepped 3 paces off trail to tie my boot and felt the world move half an inch, as if the trees had leaned in together. It doesn't take much. The official search went on for days that became weeks. Dogs traced scents that bled toward creek beds and stopped. Choppers wrote circles in the air until the fuel and money went thin. Rangers did what rangers do. They gridded and gridded and gridded. Maps cut into squares like quilts, each square walked by boot and eye. Nothing. The woods swallowed every simple thing that could lead you back to a person. A scrap of fabric, a bright plastic bottle cap, the silver flash of a zipper tooth in leaf litter. The trail community added their own rituals, notes pinned to boards. "Have you seen?" Scratched onto the backs of receipts, coffee slid across diner counters to tired men who smelled like pine and gasoline. 2 summers later, in October 2015, a civil surveyor cut through country no one hikes on purpose, chasing a line that only exists on paper. He found a collapsed tent, a scatter of gear softened by moss, and the tender silence that moves in after time has done its work. Inside, remains. In a bag, a journal. There is a difference between a ghost story and a ledger. The journal was a ledger, not haunted, haunting. A record of the days she survived after leaving the trail, marked in letters that shrink as food and strength and hope drain in order. She made a campsite, careful, organized, as if good behavior might earn her a way out. She rationed, she collected rain. She wrote names and instructions and small prayers into the paper because paper holds the shape of our sentences even when our bodies can T. One entry, the one everyone repeats like a catechism, was a request. "When you find my body, please call my husband." It isn't the saddest line in the book, The saddest lines are the ordinary ones, the ones that show she kept doing the next right thing. Keep dry, keep count, keep a corner of mind unbroken. I walked near that spot a season later, not at the exact coordinates. No one needs pilgrimage to grief, but near enough to feel the character of that pocket of woods. 2 miles isn't far on a map. 2 miles in those trees can be a whole other country, especially when the canopy kneads light into dough and spreads it thin. You shout and your own name comes back smaller, as if the forest has taxed it. The ground folds into 1,000 patient, repeating gestures, the same hump of root, the same shallow drain, and the compass needle knows north, and yet your bones do not. People like to make up clean reasons for messy ends. They say she stepped off trail briefly and couldn't rethread the blazes. They say she followed a false drainage downhill, as if water itself had palms and pushed her. Some insist she must have panicked. That word is a tidy box we put around fear to make it manageable. But the journal says otherwise. She organized herself against night after night and answered it until she couldn't. There's a dignity in that makes it worse, not better to read. There are other stories too, braided like roots around the stump of what's known. Searchers swear they beat the exact ground where she lay and somehow missed it. The grid put lines over that piece of forest, and boots walked those lines. And still the place held her. I believe that. I've watched the forest close behind me like curtains. It isn't malice. It's another grammar. We speak in steps and shouts. It answers in slope and shadow and repetition until your senses tire and begin to swallow their own tails. One evening up there I stopped and listened to the small machines of day turning over to night, gnats crossing in their invisible diagonals. A distant stream pulling its chain of silver through rocks, a branch ratcheting open under the weight of nothing obvious. I thought about Jerry counting rations, tearing a square of paper, writing the names of the people she loved so she could look at them in the morning. It isn't the horror of teeth and claws. The horror is the math of isolation, how the world can be full of you and of everyone who wants you back, and between those two fullnesses, there can still be a distance you cannot walk. The found site was close enough to trail that, in a different weather with one clean signal, one wider thread of light through the spruce, she might have stood and made it. That might have is the part that sticks. It replays. On maps, in talk, in the way hikers glance up from a blaze to check the second blaze. We carry her story the way we carry a whistle, not because we think we'll need it, but because someone once did. The last pages of Geraldine Largay weren't a legend. They were work, written against the closing hand of the woods. Do this now, do that next. The math of it breaks the heart. She should have come out. She didn't. The Appalachian Trail is generous to fools some days, and merciless to the prepared on others. What remains is a camp that weather returned to the ground, a notebook of careful sentences, and the knowledge that the line between the blaze path and the unfindable is sometimes only 3 steps wide. If the truth of this story moves you, more than monsters ever could, help us keep telling the ones the mountains would rather keep. Subscribe, share the campfire, and stay with us. These names deserve company, because the woods around here don't keep only hikers. In a coal town south of the High Ridge, a family woke on Christmas Eve 1945 to a house on fire, and by dawn, 5 children were gone without a trace. The Sodders spent a lifetime looking for them. That story is next. Fire is supposed to leave nothing behind but ashes. But in one West Virginia town, a blaze left behind a mystery instead. A family missing 5 children and questions that still burn almost 80 years later. I grew up hearing whispers about the Sodder family. In Fayetteville, West Virginia, their story isn't just a tragedy. It is a riddle carved into the memory of everyone who has ever lived near those mountains. I've stood on the lot where their house once stood, and even though the ground has long since grown over with grass, the silence there feels heavier than in any other place I've known. It's the kind of silence that carries more than absence. It carries secrets. On Christmas Eve, 1945, the Sauter family, George and Jenny, with their 9 surviving children, were gathered in their 2-story wood frame home. The air was full of the smell of pine and coal smoke. A decorated tree glowed in the corner, presents stacked beneath it. It should have been a night of laughter and warmth, but before dawn, their world was consumed by fire. Around 12:30 a.m., a telephone rang. Jenny answered, but the caller's voice was strange. A woman asking for someone Jenny didn't know. She laughed oddly, then hung up. Shaking her head, Jenny returned to bed, unaware that this odd interruption would be the last normal moment her family ever shared. Less than an hour later, she woke again to a sound on the roof. Something heavy rolling, then a loud thud. Moments later, the smell of smoke crept into her room. By the time she and George realized the house was ablaze, flames had already engulfed the stairway, cutting off the children's bedrooms upstairs. Panic took over. George, a strong man who had built his business from nothing, rushed outside barefoot into the freezing night. He tried to reach a ladder he always kept against the house, but it was gone. He ran to his trucks to move them under the window, to climb up to the children's room. But the engines refused to start, though they had worked fine the day before. He smashed a window, his arms bleeding from glass, but the fire was too fierce. Inside were 5 of their children, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, ranging in age from 5 to 14. They never came out. Neighbors gathered, helpless against the inferno. The local fire department was small and poorly equipped. They didn't arrive until morning, long after the house had collapsed into smoldering ruin. The Sauters expected to find bones in the ashes, something, anything of their children. But as the embers cooled and investigators sifted through the wreckage, no remains were found. Not a tooth, not a fragment of bone, nothing. Authorities declared the children dead, claiming the fire had incinerated their bodies completely. But George and Jenny refused to believe it. Anyone who has ever burned animal bones or seen a house fire knows that even in intense heat, remains are left behind. The Sauters began to suspect something darker, that their children hadn't died in the fire at all, but had been taken. Strange details emerged. The phone line to the house had been cut, not burned. The ladder that George always kept by the side of the house was found later in a ditch far from the property. A passerby claimed to have seen a group of people watching the fire that night, standing silently at the edge of the road. Another witness swore they saw the children in a car driving away while the house still burned. Rumors spread like smoke through the town. Some said it was revenge. George Sauter was outspoken in his criticism of Mussolini and the fascist regime in Italy, and Fayetteville had a large Italian immigrant population, some still loyal to the old leader. Threats had been made against George in the months before the fire. Others said the mafia had been involved, punishing the family for refusing to cooperate. Jenny could not accept the official story. She tested the theory herself, burning small piles of animal bones in a wood stove, discovering that even hours of fire left remains. How, then, could 5 children vanish completely? The Sauters began receiving strange signs. A few years after the fire, Jenny received a photograph in the mail of a young man with features strikingly similar to her missing son, Louis. On the back were cryptic words. Louis Sauter. I love brother Frankie. Elil boys, A90132 or 35. The photograph was postmarked from Kentucky, but carried no return address. George drove across the country following leads, convinced his children were alive somewhere, but every trail went cold. They even erected a billboard along Route 16, pleading for answers, with the children's faces staring out at passing cars. For decades, that billboard stood, a haunting reminder to everyone in Fayetteville that 5 children had vanished in the night and never returned. I've spoken to old-timers in Fayetteville who remember standing in front of that billboard as kids, their parents telling them, "This is what happens when the truth is buried." To them, it was more than a mystery. It was a warning. Standing on that ground myself, I could almost see the shadows of that night. The snow falling gently, flames licking the sky, parents screaming their children's names. And then, the silence that followed. Silence where 5 voices used to be. What haunts me most is the image of Jenny wearing black mourning clothes for the rest of her life, never giving up hope, never accepting ashes as the final word. When she died in 1989, she still believed her children had been taken, not lost. And in her heart, she probably believed they were still out there somewhere. The Sodder children's disappearance is one of Appalachia's darkest unsolved mysteries. Fire should have ended the story, but instead, it began decades of questions. Were the children stolen? Were they killed before the blaze? Or did the mountain simply hide the truth the way it hides so many things? If stories like this strike you, help us keep telling them. Subscribe, share, and stay with us. Every echo keeps the fire alive, because the Sodders weren't alone. A year after their tragedy, far north in Vermont, entire families began disappearing in what would later be called the Bennington Triangle, a place where the woods seemed to open up and swallow people whole. They found him in a tent, maps spread around him, a notebook at his side. He had no ID, no phone, no wallet. Hundreds had seen him alive on the Appalachian Trail, but when he died, no one knew his name. I remember the summer of 2018 when the story first broke. A hiker had been found dead in his tent in Florida, emaciated but peaceful, surrounded by notebooks, maps, and gear. He'd walked thousands of miles along the Appalachian Trail and its side routes, meeting dozens of people. Hikers had shared food with him, swapped stories, even camped beside him. They knew him by his trail name. Mostly harmless. But when his body was discovered, no one knew who he really was. The man was found in Big Cypress National Preserve, the southern terminus of the Florida Trail. A pair of hikers stumbled across the yellow tent. Inside was a man lying in his sleeping bag, his body reduced to skin and bone. His gear was neat, his belongings carefully arranged. No signs of struggle, no evidence of violence, just a man who had wasted away, alone. Rangers were baffled. They found no identification, no phone, no credit cards. Only notebooks filled with cryptic notes and maps of the trail. He had food left in his pack, which deepened the mystery. Why had he starved? His stove worked. His tent was in good shape. He had money tucked into a bag. There was no clear reason for his death. The trail community reeled. Dozens of hikers came forward. "I met him in Virginia," one said. "I saw him in Georgia," said another. They remembered him as quiet but kind, a man who kept to himself but wasn't unfriendly. He always introduced himself as Denim, or mostly harmless. He spoke of working in tech, of wanting to unplug. Some recalled that he'd mentioned being from New York, or that he was heading south because he wasn't ready to stop walking. Photos emerged. Trail angels had snapped him smiling at shelters, resting at trailheads. His face was lean but warm, his beard sun-bleached. Hundreds recognized him, yet no one knew his real name. For months, the mystery deepened. Newspapers called him the unknown hiker. Internet forums lit up. Amateur sleuths scoured missing persons reports. His story struck a nerve. How could someone be so visible and yet so anonymous? He wasn't hiding. He'd been seen by hundreds. But when it mattered most, he was no one. DNA was tested. Leads trickled in. Still nothing. The nickname, Mostly Harmless, came from a joke he made about the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where Earth is described as mostly harmless. That small detail made him feel more real, more human, but it wasn't enough. I think what haunted people was how carefully he seemed to have chosen his death. He'd walked until his body gave out. He'd carried notebooks filled with notes about coding and dreams of building a simple life. Yet he'd stripped away every tie that could bring him back to the world. 2 years later, in 2021, investigators finally matched his DNA. His name was Vance Rodriguez, a man from Louisiana who had worked in IT. Friends described him as brilliant but troubled, a man haunted by depression, drawn to solitude. They weren't surprised he had walked away from everything. What shocked them was how far he had gone, how thoroughly he de-erased himself until he became a ghost walking the trail. I think about him often. Hikers still tell stories of meeting him, of the man who smiled quietly, accepted their food, and then moved on. Some say he looked already halfway gone even then. The forest doesn't just take people by force. Sometimes it gives them the place to disappear willingly. Mostly Harmless wasn't stolen by the Appalachians. He walked into them carrying a silence he meant to keep. His story isn't a ghost tale or a crime. It's a reminder of how fragile identity is. Hundreds saw him, spoke to him, remembered his kindness. Yet when he died, he was a mystery. In the Appalachians, sometimes the scariest story isn't about vanishing without a trace. It's about being seen by everyone and still disappearing. If stories like this linger with you, help us keep telling them. Subscribe, share, and remember. Names matter because without them we all risk becoming echoes. But not every Appalachian tale is quiet. Some are loud, lit by lanterns, soaked in the echoes of trains. In the hills of Ohio, the Moonville Tunnel still hums with the footsteps of men long dead, and some swear their lanterns still swing in the dark. Abandoned places are quiet by design. But in one Appalachian quarry, silence was replaced by screams that seemed to come from the rock itself. Quarries have a way of swallowing sound. The pits are deep, the walls sheer, and when you stand inside, your voice spirals upward instead of outward. Ours had been abandoned for decades, a scar in the hills where stone had once been carved out for road projects. Now it was just a hollow, or at least that's what we thought, until the summer when the screaming began. Locals first heard it in August. A family living half a mile away swore they heard a drawn-out cry in the middle of the night. They thought it was an animal, maybe a fox or a bobcat. But foxes don't sound like tearing metal, and this was longer, rawer, echoing across the valley like someone trapped below. By the second week, people were whispering. Teens dared each other to go listen. Farmers claimed they heard it when the wind shifted, even with their tractors running. The sheriff, tired of the calls, dismissed it as nature. But people in town had lived with nature all their lives. They knew when something was wrong. One night, 3 of us decided to see for ourselves. The pit was about a 20-minute walk from the road, hidden behind a fringe of pines. We carried lights and nothing else. The ground crunched with loose rock as we climbed the rim. At 12:31 a.m., it happened. The first scream tore out of the quarry and wrapped itself around us. It wasn't an echo, it was origin, the kind of sound that vibrates in your ribs and makes your teeth ache. We looked at each other but couldn't speak. Then another came, closer, sharper, from directly below where we stood. Will, the EMT among us, tried to be rational. He edged forward, light cutting across the pit. His beam found only walls and shadows. Then a third scream burst out, and this one wasn't distant at all. It came from under our feet, as if the stone floor itself had opened a mouth. The rocks trembled under us, dust showered down. We bolted back down the path, hearts racing, convinced the ground might collapse. But the quarry held, solid and dark, even as the sound faded behind us. The next day we told the sheriff. He brought in an engineer. They stood at the rim in daylight while we explained. The engineer shook his head. He said shifting stone could create noises when temperatures changed. He said echoes in enclosed spaces could sound human. He had an answer for everything. But 2 nights later, a group of teenagers went down into the quarry floor. They were brave or foolish, or both. At 3 in the morning, one of them scrambled out alone, white-faced and shaking. The others had to be pulled out at dawn by search teams. None of them were physically harmed, but one boy muttered the same sentence over and over. "It said my name. It screamed my name." By September, the quarry was posted with no trespassing signs. That didn't stop the rumors. People claimed to hear the cries from miles away, even through closed windows. A hunter said his hounds refused to go near the ridge. The sound was fading with the cooler weather, but every time the night turned warm again, someone reported hearing it. Skeptics still argue. They say it was foxes, or stress fractures in the rock, or teenagers stirring up a story. But those who were there don't need to argue. They remember how the ground shook, how the air itself seemed to vibrate, how the screams went on longer than any living thing could draw breath. The quarry is silent now, as far as anyone admits. But it sits waiting, a hollow in the hills. People drive past the old access road and glance away, because they know what we learned standing at the rim, that silence is no guarantee of peace. Sometimes it's just the breath before the next scream. Some places in the Appalachians don't just echo sound, they create it. The quarry was supposed to be empty, but the cries that came from it carried weight, enough to break rational explanations. Whether it was the stone itself or something trapped beneath it, the truth is that not all silences stay quiet. If screams can rise out of solid rock, then lights can just as easily appear where no one should be. Our next story takes us to a ridge where strange white orbs moved with purpose and left the ground scarred by fresh-dug holes. They say if you walk the tracks near Moonville Tunnel at night, you'll see a lantern swinging in the dark, but the man carrying it lost his head more than a century ago. Deep in the southeastern hills of Ohio, hidden among thick forest and ridges of sandstone, stands the dark mouth of the Moonville Tunnel. The town it once served is gone, swallowed by the Appalachian woods, reduced to mossy foundations and forgotten graves. The railroad is abandoned, the ties rotting, the iron rails torn up decades ago. All that remains is the tunnel. Its stone arch scarred by graffiti, its inside slick with moss and damp air. Most hikers see only a ruin, but to locals, the tunnel is alive. They'll tell you of footsteps that echo when no one walks, of lanterns that swing in the dark, of a ghostly brakeman still doing his duty long after the train line itself has died. The legend begins in the late 1800s, when Moonville was still a mining town clinging to the forest. The railroad cut through the hills, carrying coal and timber. It was dangerous work. Trains ran heavy, and the tunnel, narrow, dark, and poorly lit, was a trap for anyone unlucky enough to be inside when the engine roared through. One night, a brakeman named Theodore Lawhead, though some say his name was lost, walked the tracks with a lantern. His job was to guide the train, signaling ahead. Accounts differ. Some say he had been drinking, others that the train came faster than expected. But the end was the same. He was struck in the tunnel, crushed under wheels, his lantern shattering against the stone. When workers pulled his body out, his head was missing. They buried what they found in a rough grave near the line. Soon after, the sightings began. Engineers reported a light in the tunnel, swaying back and forth as if warning them. But when the engine drew near, the lantern vanished. Passengers spoke of a man in ragged clothes standing at the far end, his face hidden in shadow. Hikers described hearing the metallic clang of iron on iron, though the tracks were silent. By the turn of the century, Moonville was fading. Mines closed, families drifted away. But the ghost stories only grew. In 1905, a young woman walking home along the tracks was struck and killed. Locals said her pale figure could be seen wandering the hillsides, her dress glowing in moonlight. Later still, miners who died in cave-ins or accidents were added to the tunnel's haunted roll call. The place became a gathering of restless spirits, all tied to the same dark stone passage. I walked there myself one autumn evening. The path to Moonville is quiet, the forest thick with oak and beech. When you round the bend, the tunnel rises out of the earth like a mouth. Inside, the air is damp and cool, heavy with the smell of wet stone. Graffiti covers the walls, but no spray paint can erase the weight of history pressing down. At the center of the tunnel, I turned off my flashlight. The darkness was total, a living thing that pressed against my skin. At first there was only silence, then the faint drip of water, and then something else, a shuffle, light but steady, coming from behind me. I spun, light on, but the tunnel was empty. My heart hammered. I left faster than I'd meant to, the echoes of my boots chasing me into the trees. Paranormal investigators have recorded strange phenomena at Moonville for decades. Some capture orbs floating in photos. Others hear disembodied voices on tape, calling names that aren't theirs. One group swears they filmed a faint green lantern swinging in the tunnel, bobbing back and forth before fading into the stone. Skeptics call it imagination, tricks of light, echoes of sound, fear feeding itself. But locals don't doubt. They tell you not to walk the tracks at night, not to linger in the tunnel after dark. Some say the brakeman is still at his post, warning trains that will never come. Others say he's searching for his missing head. And then there are those who believe the tunnel is simply cursed ground, where death has piled up too often to stay silent. Moonville itself has vanished. The town that once clung to the hillsides is gone, its houses collapsed, its cemetery overgrown. But the tunnel endures, its stones stubborn against time. Every October, when fog curls through the valley and the leaves glow red, crowds gather there. They bring cameras, lanterns, and nervous laughter. And every year, someone swears they see the light, swinging, patient, waiting. The truth is, the tunnel doesn't need belief. It stands dark and indifferent in the woods. Whether ghost or memory, something lingers in its damp air. Walk through it alone at night and you'll understand. The past hasn't left. It's pacing beside you. Moonville Tunnel is Appalachia's reminder that death doesn't always end with silence. The trains have stopped, the town has died, but the footsteps continue. Whether it's a brakeman with his lantern or just the memory of all who perished there, the tunnel still hums with echoes. You've just heard 7 of the most chilling true stories from Appalachia. If these echoes kept you on edge tonight, don't let them fade into silence. Hit subscribe, tap like, and share this video with others who crave the dark corners of the mountains. Every story we tell keeps the fire burning, and with your support, the echoes will only grow louder. This is Eerie Echoes, and we'll see you in the next story.